John Kelly will be leaving, but I don't know if I can say retiring, but he's a great guy. John Kelly will be leaving at the end of the year. We'll be announcing who will be taking John's place. It might be on an interim basis. I'll be announcing that over the next day or two, but John will be leaving at the end of the year. He's been with me almost 2 years now, as you know, between the two positions. So we're probably going to see him in a little while. But John Kelly, ready? Are you ready? So John Kelly will be leaving toward the end of the year, at the end of the year. And I appreciate his service very much. Thank you. Thank you all.
Vice President Mike Pence's chief of staff, Nick Ayers, has long been rumored as the most likely or top contender for replacing chief of staff John Kelly. Again, John Roberts, Fox's John Roberts, reported back in November that when these potential changes to the cabinet were being discussed, that Ayers is a name that came up, that Ayers is someone who is respected at the White House. They think he's a smart manager and good political operative, and someone that President Trump likes quite a lot. Obviously, we heard from President Trump there that the next person appointed could just be on a temporary basis. But if you guys remember, in just this last month, just a couple of weeks ago, Fox News Sunday, Chris Wallace sat down with President Trump. He asked him about that plan that was made back in the summer to keep Chief of Staff John Kelly until 2020. And President Trump seemed to throw some doubt into that timeline when he spoke with Chris Wallace. He said that there were some things that Chief of Staff John Kelly does really well that he liked, but there were some things that he didn't necessarily like. Chris Wallace then pressed him again to say, so is 2020 not necessarily set in stone? And President Trump said that we would see. Obviously, fast forward to just a couple weeks in front of that interview, and we now know that Chief of Staff John Kelly will be leaving at the end of this year.
As Chief of Staff is out. Joining us now to discuss the announcement, how it could affect the markets, the founder of Capitalist Pig, Jonathan Hoenig. Jonathan, to say the markets have been uncertain over the past week would be an understatement. Volatile as well. They don't like uncertainty, and now the White House Chief of Staff's job is up in the air come Monday morning.
Yeah, I mean, this certainly will just another factor, Leland, that's impacting what has already been a tremendously volatile period for stocks. And not just this last week, which saw 3+ days of 500-point swings in stock prices. Let's not forget that October was down for stocks. November was also down for stocks. And so far, December is now down for stocks, and we're down year to date. So to your point, I mean, John Kelly's leaving the White House is just one more bit of uncertainty thrown into the mix here. Now, I actually think it, ironically, could be positive for stocks. Some of the confusion this week was over trade, and I think perhaps a new chief of staff could maybe bring a little more discipline to the president's Twitter messages about trade. But net, this is another element of confusion to an already very confused and uncertain stock market.
Sure, but Jonathan, I mean, John Kelly was brought in to try to impose some discipline on President Trump's Twitter feed, and clearly he was not able to do that. So it'd be tough to see, how somebody else could do that if a general as impressive as General Kelly was not able to do that. But, Jonathan, some of the other names that are being tossed around as a potential replacement, of course, Nick Ayers, he's the front runner, Vice President Mike Pence's chief of staff. But some of the other names that we've heard about, U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, the budget Director Mike Mulvaney, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, though that's a little bit more out there. If somebody like that were to take the job of chief of staff, how do you think the markets would respond?
I think it has very big implications because all those individuals you mentioned have a big say at the table when it comes to trade. And, fundamentally, I believe that is the major impact here, what's really causing so much consternation in the stock market. A lot of confusion about trade, specifically about tariffs. For months, market participants, Americans were told that the tariffs were just a bargaining chip, as you will. But what we've heard over the last couple of months is that company after company have reported billions of dollars in costs, Ford and GM most recently, as a result of these tariffs. So whoever the new chief of staff is could have a big impact on trade and the market as well.
We bring in Fox News chief political anchor of Special Report, Brett Baer, on the phone. Brett, what do you make of the president saying Kelly's out without naming a replacement and then saying we're going to name somebody but maybe interim basis?
Well, good afternoon. I think that that is how this president operates. It's kind of like a tease to something to come, and he's going to make an announcement. It's likely going to be Nick Ayers, the vice president's chief of staff, who we've seen travel with President Trump on Air Force One without Vice President Pence. So he's established this close relationship and respect with Nick Ayers outside of the vice president being present there. So it's the going bet is that he will be the choice because he's a political operative and heading into a new dynamic with House Democrats taking control in January and obviously setting up for eventually another run in 2020. One believes that that will be something to tap into. I think the big moment here is not that this happened. It's more a look at John Kelly's stint. You know, when he came in, he was a very controlling force that calmed down a undisciplined, frankly, White House. So he made the trains run on time and controlled access to the Oval Office. It was seen to really get the White House more in a operational sense, better organized. But that then, made some people mad, including the president at times, and has been widely reported about, dust-ups that they had over recent months.
You talk about Nick Ayers and the relationship the president had with him. Going back to some reporting from October of 2017, a little more than a year ago, when then Nick Ayers, chief of staff to Vice President Pence, was meeting with some wealthy GOP donors, and he reportedly said that he wanted to purge GOP lawmakers that didn't quickly enough rally around the president's agenda. Is this now bringing in a much harder line, more savvy, tougher political operator to try and whip Capitol Hill as the Republicans go into the minority in the House?
Definitely. I mean, his whole being before this current job was political operative, knowing where the skeletons are buried in Washington, an operator in Republican circles, and somebody who knows Capitol Hill very well. So, obviously, in that instance where you're talking about that reporting, that's something that President Trump echoed from a news conference right after the midterm election, talking about Republicans who lost, saying they should have rallied around the Trump administration and the president himself.
So, Brett, if John Kelly was able to bring in the order and the discipline that the Trump White House at that point in time so desperately needed, what would somebody like Nick Ayers be able to bring in with his background heading into 2020 and heading into this moment where Democrats are about to take control of the House and you've got the Mueller investigation really seeming to hit a fever pitch?
Yeah, I think it's maneuvering, finding the cracks to where there could be negotiation. Remember, there's probably going to be a lot of subpoenas that are issued for administration officials. There will be investigations that are going forward. And in that, there will still be legislation that House Democrats will want to get through. All of that requires a deft political touch, and perhaps the president is going to choose Nick Ayers to do that. Again, we're speculating now, and he is the leading front runner, because the president has teased that he's going to make this announcement over the next couple of days. If you look at this exit of Kelly means that in the White House itself, since his election, there have been 3 communications directors, a national security advisor switch, and a press secretary, let alone outside of the White House proper and all of the shifts that have happened in this administration. There's been a lot of turnover. After a midterm election, often there are jobs that shift. This administration has seen more than most.
You said an interesting word, and you're right that we are speculating on Nick Ayers, but you said a deft political hand. Is Nick Ayers a deft political hand, or is he a political hammer?
I think he can be both. It's cracking the whip and keeping people in line is one thing, but also knowing how some congressman or some chairman of a committee, what issues he or she is interested in and can be negotiated with, dealing with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, specifically Pelosi now, who will likely take the speakership and deal with the gavel there on the House side. It's much more a political-looking job as you have another party taking over one chamber of Congress and you get ready for a re-election. John Kelly was well-positioned to structure access to try to get things, pieces of the puzzle put on the table for the president, was not as accomplished when it came to, the political ins and outs of Washington, D.C. Had a very successful stint, Kelly did, at Homeland Security, and was largely seen as getting a White House, and when I say organized and on track, from where it was. Obviously, there are a lot of stories about different elements of the White House not working effectively, but Kelly tried to get everything on the train track.
We've been focusing so much on Nick Ayers, and of course, there's, a very good probability that he will be the next chief of staff. But you know better than anyone else, Brett, that, nothing is final until President Trump says it's final. So I'm curious, are you hearing any other names other than Ayers as a possible replacement to John Kelly?
Well, for a long time, Mick Mulvaney was talked about as a possible chief of staff, and his name was still surfacing around. I think that has fallen off, but again, you don't know what you don't know with the Trump administration and the president's choices. I do think it's probably going to be Ayers. And I think that there's going to be a lot of different efforts. Remember the White House counsel also switched just recently, and the legal staff in the White House is going to be girding for a battle, not just with House Democrats, but obviously with the fallout from the Mueller investigation and whatever comes out of the Southern District of New York.
Brett, as the president was leaving the White House and announcing that John Kelly was leaving, he said he was a great guy and appreciated his service. You had one of the more telling and fascinating interviews with John Kelly that have been done, perhaps the one that made by far the most amount of news and reportedly really rankled the president in the way Kelly reacted. Any thoughts on where the relationship between president and chief of staff broke down, where went from John Kelly will be here through 2020 to he's out after the midterms?
I think there's a lot of elements to it. I'm not sure that the family ever really enjoyed Kelly's style of controlling access to the president, and so that was a sling and arrow towards him. I think that the president got frustrated that somehow he was trying to be controlled in one way or another. But in that interview that I did with General Kelly, that as White House Chief of Staff, he was very honest, and I think that's often the issue in Washington and gets you in trouble. And I think he may have gotten on the wrong side of the president on the way he described the wall, on the way he described being paid for by Mexico, a number of different elements of that interview that perhaps the president didn't like. But if you look back at John Kelly's service, first of all, to the country as a Marine general, and long service, and believed that as Homeland Security Secretary and as White House Chief of Staff, he was continuing to serve the country in a different way, but in the same kind of vein as he did as a military man in uniform. And obviously lost his son in the war in Afghanistan, has really served the country tremendously for a long, long time, and has said that job was the toughest he'd ever had. He used some different words in the Woodward book, which he later said that he didn't say. But I think that people will look back and say, this guy really put it out for the country.
It would be impossible to say anything else in terms of that. Brett Baer, anchor of Special Report, 6 p.m. Eastern Monday. Brett, we can say it every weekend. You're going to have a lot to talk about.
All the time.
All the time. Thank you,
Thanks,
sir.
Brett.
Enjoy your Saturday. All right.
Big breaking news this hour, which is, of course, the news that John Kelly, the president's chief of staff, is officially out. It's been rumored about for quite some time. Now it's final. So here to weigh in is our political panel. Eric Beach, he is the co-chair of Great America PAC and former Ohio State Senator, now with American University, and a contributor for the Washington Examiner, Capri Cafaro. So, Capri, I'll start with you.
Sure.
What do you make of the news? John Kelly's out.
Well, I think that it's not necessarily a surprise. We've been hearing for a number of weeks now that there's been tensions within the White House. I do think that there will end up being a different tenor and tone as well in the absence of, former General Kelly, because, when he came in and took over from Reince Priebus, we heard a lot about how he was trying to make things more regimented, how he was trying to control the flow of information to President Trump and the folks inside the White House. And so I think it looks as if, from what we're hearing, that the top pick might be Vice President Pence's chief of staff, which would be a much more political pick going into 2020.
Eric, what do you think? What do you make of this breaking news?
Yeah. First of all, I think there's two things here. John Kelly's a patriot, and he did bring organization to this White House. And there's been a cloud over this White House, especially from the special counsel's investigation, that there was really a lot to try to get through there. And in these next 2 years, there may have to be some changes. And the one thing where the president and John Kelly disagreed was on illegal immigration. That's the number one issue, and to many conservatives and Republicans and Trump supporters, the number one crisis facing us here today. And, I think with Nick or whoever does come in, they're going to really reshape that agenda and bring it back into what he ran on and try to deliver those campaign promises here in the next 2 years.
Well, and Nick Ayers, as you said, the vice president's chief of staff, a political guy. But I mean, heading into 2020, perhaps it's not such a bad thing to have a political guy running the West Wing. Capri?
I think that's probably part of President Trump's calculus, if that's who he really chooses. Unfortunately, governing has become so political, and that's not necessarily new. But I think that because President Trump is such was a unique candidate, is a unique president in his governing style, that I think that having somebody who has a political background in the White House might be, what he's looking for. But don't forget, again, Reince Priebus was the actual head of the RNC and was the chief of staff, and we didn't necessarily see that kind of political machine coming out of the White House. So I think it's a little too early to tell. And I personally believe that the more any governing body, Democrats and Republicans, the more you focus on doing your job, politics takes care of itself.
Eric, you're close to the folks in the Trump administration. Are you hearing any other names being talked about for this job other than Nick Ayers?
No, I mean, look, I think that if Nick comes on board, what he shares is the same vision that the president ran on as a candidate. And I think no matter who the chief of staff is, they need to follow those instincts that the president runs on and campaigns on and really tries to deliver to make into policy. And we didn't see that. Even with Reince Priebus, we didn't see that. There was a lot of contradictions when it came to, the Senate leadership or even the House leadership. So a chief of staff needs to execute President Trump has great political instincts because he understands where middle America is and how to talk to middle America. So I think whoever we see here at chief of staff, it's okay to be political, but they need to understand the Trump vision.
So let's talk just a little bit about John Kelly. How do you think he's going to be remembered as a chief of staff? What will his legacy be, Capri?
I think that it depends on who you ask. I think that, anybody that's involved with the Trump administration is somehow now going to be defined by the fact that they are affiliated with the Trump administration. So, yes, he'd given, decades of service in the military and was, the head of the Southern Command, for example. Obviously was a very accomplished general. That's always going to be part of his legacy. But the fact that he took on being President Trump's chief of staff, I think will live with him. And I think that, again, depending on who you talk to, I think that there will be some that say, yes, he's brought order, to a White House that, is full of newbies. But I think that there are others that will say, well, he didn't do enough to keep the White House focused, on track, and moderate their vision. But I do agree with my colleague talking about the fact that people are the President Trump is looking for someone to execute his vision. And we're seeing that time and time again with his choices with the UN ambassador, for example, Heather Nauert, and Mike Pompeo. And we're seeing this throughout his choices now in his cabinet, too.
And we are watching Air Force One about to take off on its way to the Army-Navy game, where President Trump is going to be watching and announcing another staff shakeup, his new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But back to John Kelly. Eric, what do you make of his time as chief of staff? What do you think his legacy will be? And was he a good chief of staff?
He's nothing short of a patriot, and he was a great chief of staff. He came into a situation that was in disarray, and we have to call that what it is. And, it wasn't left to him in a good place, and he brought a lot of order into the White House. And again, he never undercut, the president, at least publicly. He never tried to go against that agenda, and there was a lot of parts of that agenda that he actually disagreed with philosophically. So I think, class and character defines General Kelly, and I think he'll be remembered as such.
So how does the West Wing operate in his absence? Capri, what do you think are some of the changes that we will see in the days to come as Kelly makes his way out?
Well, I think that, in the absence of a chief of staff, you're obviously going to have, one less person in that chain of command. And so I think that what we may see is a more unbridled President Trump, someone with a situation where, he doesn't have a barrier, a filter. And so he's going to be probably dealing more directly with individuals in the West Wing, maybe even leadership in the House and the Senate. And so I think we'll probably see, at least in the short term, more of Trump being Trump. I think we're going to have to just wait and see who comes and fills that position and how they then decide to organize the West Wing, if they empower President Trump, which I think is more likely, or if they try to, hamstring him and, try to take away his phone and this sort of thing, which I sincerely doubt.
Absolutely. And yeah, of course. I mean, Chief of Staff John Kelly, he was able to provide quite a bit more order than perhaps his predecessor, Reince Priebus, was able to. But still, nobody's going to be able to control President Trump's tweeting and his use of his cell phone to do that. It's the way that he communicates with his supporters. And for him, it's proven to be very effective. Eric, what do you make of how this might change or lead to some other potential staff shakeups within the West Wing? If Kelly's out, does he take anybody with him?
Well, possibly. I think the staff needs to get on board once again. Trump ran against 17 candidates in the primary. He defeated Hillary Clinton because he had a certain vision on illegal immigration, on trade deals, really on foreign policy. So, I want Trump to be Trump because he was smarter than the rest of the field and he understood what Americans really wanted in that America First agenda. So I think the staff, it's not incumbent upon the president to change his views and his ways. It's incumbent to the staff that says, if you want to work at the White House, we're going to execute the vision that he ran and won on. Remember, he was elected.
He was elected, and now we're heading into 2020, and it's really just around the corner. And you look at somebody like Nick Ayers, who is who's obviously being talked about as a potential replacement for John Kelly. You look at somebody like him who could very easily bring a lot of political instincts, things that President Trump would really like to this West Wing. Could be valuable to have him in the White House at a time like this, but he also has a lot of support from folks like Jared and Ivanka, but also some detractors within the West Wing. Final question, Capri. Sure. When do you think that we will know who John Kelly's replacement will be?
Well, it looks like he's going to be leaving at the end of the year, according to President Trump. So I think that we'll probably hear, the potential replacement in the next few weeks. So I think probably right either between Christmas and New Year's, maybe.
Yeah, and President Trump himself said that we could expect at least some kind of appointment, perhaps an interim appointment, within the next 2 or 3 days. So, Capri, Eric, thanks for coming on and breaking down this breaking news for us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.